We're one day from a government shutdown. I'm glad we have a path to avoid it on a temporary basis. But this government by crisis is no way to run a country. We've been calling for responsible bipartisan budget negotiations for months. These negotiations could have avoided this necessary crisis altogether. Once we fund the government for a short period of time, I hope the Republicans will finally join us to negotiate a bipartisan way to stop the devastating sequestration cuts. And they are devastating. Our principles are clear: raise the budget caps to help the middle class, and of course our military, and no partisan policy writers that attempt to poison the deal. The Republican leader has already conceded that budget negotiations will crack the sequester caps. That's Senator McConnell, and I appreciate that very much. I heard that he said a few minutes ago that he wanted to see if they could come up with top numbers for the next 2 fiscal years. That would be wonderful. Both parties know that budget sequestration is bad for our country. How many times have we heard Senator Graham, Senator McCain talk about how bad sequestration is? So we need to do something about it, not talk about it. There's no reason to wait till December to stop negotiating. I should say start negotiating. That December 11th is going to be here before we know it. And, you know, we have to also understand that in the mix of this is the debt ceiling. They have to be handled together. It's the only way to intelligently do this. So let's start working on a bipartisan way to stop all of this crisis. There's so many of them. We can do it, but only if Republicans don't divert us to yet another catastrophe. Senator Durbin?
3/4 of the Republican presidential candidates think closing down the government in a fit of political pique is a great idea. 3/4 of the American people think it's a dumb idea. Today, the Republicans are congratulating themselves that they just might be able to keep the government open until December the 11th. It's a sad state of affairs when the GOP measures success on not shutting down the government. It's hard to follow what this party's thinking. This is no cause for celebration. The American people have every reason to be appalled by the Republican majority in the House and the Senate and unable to govern. Let's assume the Senate will pass this clean CR, say tomorrow. The House does the same. I don't like to make assumptions about what's going to happen over there, incidentally. We're setting up another deadline in December. It's a holiday gift for America, the prospect of shutting down the government again. There's already talk of another continuing resolution for the rest of the year by House Republicans who aren't yet willing to come to the table. Is this how they govern, when the Republicans are in the majority of both the House and the Senate? If they did what they promised, it would lock sequestration caps in place, stifle growth, and hamstring domestic priorities. In fact, locking these sequestration caps in place would set non-defense spending $9 billion lower than it is this year when you account for inflation. That's a $37 billion cut from the president's budget. No growth for medical research. That's a Republican answer. It would not take into account the new demands of the Department of Homeland Security. No growth for Homeland Security. And it would be devastating to the Department of Defense, which has never, I repeat, never operated under a continuing resolution for a full year. Once Congress passes this CR, Republicans have to get serious and work with us, as we've invited them to do since last June, to put together a budget agreement. End sequestration, fund defense and non-defense fairly, and let's not get into a war of riders. Threatening to shut down the government may be popular with Republican presidential candidates and maybe among some members of the Republican conference, but you don't have to go far outside the building to hear how reckless this would be for America. Now's the time for Congress to do the responsible thing and get busy putting together a long-term bipartisan budget.
Senator Schumer.
Well, as we look forward to the tumultuous weeks ahead, we're confronted with deadline after deadline. If the past is any prologue, Republican leaders will wait until there's a crisis in the 11th hour and then risk disaster. But it doesn't have to be that way. We Democrats are ready to start negotiating on a budget that protects our national and economic security and creates jobs. We're ready to pass a bill that ensure we don't devastate the economy and default on the debt. But we need to start working on these issues sooner rather than later. CBO estimated if we lifted the sequester caps, we'd get 800,000 new jobs. We're talking about jobs, jobs, jobs. And our Republican opponents, our Republican friends, are arguing no jobs. We hope our Republican colleagues won't waste any time and join us at the negotiating table. Just yesterday, Leader McCarthy, he rolled out a vision for American foreign policy that relies on a strong and robust military. But every military leader from every branch has been crystal clear that sequestration harms the military and that they support a federal budget that makes the necessary investments in the military and our middle class. Well, what is it, Majority Leader McCarthy? You want a robust foreign policy, but then you want to handcuff the military with sequestration? Can't have it both ways. Democrats and large numbers of Republicans agree, which is why both House and Senate leaders on the Republican side have said they'll enter into negotiations to fund the government in a fair and balanced way. These negotiations are the only way we can reach an agreement to avoid a disastrous fall hurting jobs and the economy. The recovery keeps moving forward. We've made real progress in creating jobs. An unnecessary shutdown would be a huge step back that would deal a real blow to growth in jobs and to our economy. Republicans should not let it happen. So, rather than catering to the extreme right wing of their caucus and giving into the same dysfunctional dynamic that has plagued the Capitol for years, we hope that the winners of the leadership election in the House will work with Democrats to find a path forward on funding the government, avoiding default, and creating jobs. Instead of pledging intransigence and gridlock to pick up a handful of extra votes from the very most conservative, hard-right members of this entire body, we hope Republicans running for leadership will reach across the aisle and try a new approach. If Republican leaders continue to let the hard-right tail wag the Republican dog, the consequences this fall could be catastrophic. We hope they choose to work with Democrats and find a way out of this fiscal maze that's ahead of us.
Senator Murray.
Well, here's a pretty basic piece of advice that Republicans can't seem to wrap their heads around. If you have a long time to avoid a terrible situation, you shouldn't wait until the very last minute to get to work. It's advice we give to our kids when they have class projects. It's for drivers who see dangers up on the road, and it is for elected officials and budget deadlines. For months, we have been standing here asking Republicans to join us at the table. But for months, they have asked us to wait. For months, we have talked about this deadline, October 1st. We said there is no reason to wait until the countdown clocks come out before we get to work. But for months, they have ignored us. If we hadn't seen this happen so many times, I would say it is absurd. But unfortunately, it has become just the way Republicans have decided to operate. Even today, right up against the deadline, House Republicans are far more interested in spending the day attacking Planned Parenthood and women's health than avoiding a crisis. They are so focused on their Tea Party base, so concerned about the members of their party who think the word compromise is a dirty word, and they feel the need to engage in this bizarre theater and wait until the last minute to do what they knew all along would have to get done. Republican leaders seem to think they have perfected the art of governing by swerving away. It is an awful way to run Congress. It leaves us inches from disaster every time there's a new deadline, and it needs to change. So once the Senate finishes its work to keep government from shutting down, and once House Republicans accept at the very last minute they need to do the same, I'm hoping the next deadline can be different. I'm hoping we can avoid the drama. avoid the countdown clocks, avoid the last-minute swerve, and do what we did in 2013, work together, negotiate, reach another bipartisan budget deal. And I'm confident we can do it because we've done it before. And it will be up to Republican leaders to join us at the table so we can do it again. And one more thing before I close. I watched some of the so-called oversight hearings in the House today on Planned Parenthood, and I don't think anyone could have called that a hearing, because I'm confident the Republicans didn't listen to anyone but themselves. But without any Republicans from the House here to interrupt me, let me be very clear. Democrats will not allow Republicans to get in the way of a woman's constitutional right to make her own health care decisions. And the faster Republicans can finally accept that fact, the sooner Congress can get back to work for our families and communities as they expect us to do.
Good ending.
Yes.
Leader McConnell just said that he and Boehner spoke to President Obama last week about starting budget talks. Were you aware of that? Have you been invited to these budget talks?
The answer is yes, I was aware of it, and there's stuff going on as we speak
So were you
on the
invited?
staff level.
Were you invited to those talks?
There were no talks. It was done on the telephone.
Talk about setting up the talks, and you guys been invited to participate in those talks.
If there are any talks, I'll be invited.
Leader Reid, how does Boehner's retirement change your calculus when it comes to securing a budget deal? And will you look to get something done before he leaves at the end of the month?
Well, I wasn't here, but I was told by my staff that Senator McConnell said he had talked to Boehner the last few hours, and that they're trying to come up with a top line for 2 successive budget years, and I think that's good. I hope they do that. As I mentioned in my prepared remarks, we have a perfect storm brewing here because of the crisis they've created. We have debt ceiling. We have XM Bank, which is going under what's already closed. We have, of course, we've got to do something about funding the government after December 11th. We have IMF that is an embarrassment to our country. We have no money in that. We have lots of things to do, and the debt ceiling is not going to be around forever. We're running out of money. It's going to have to, it'll come very soon, and I would hope that Boehner would make it easy on his people who are going to follow him to get it all done before he leaves, because of the things I see in the paper, as Senator Schumer mentioned, that's quite frightening. I mean, people cheering for default on the debt ceiling, people hoping the government would be closed, but this is no new textbook they've written. Remember the last closure of the government for 17 days. 2/3 of the Republicans in the House voted to keep government closed more than 17 days. So I hope we can get this stuff done before the Speaker moves on to whatever he's going to do. Oh,
There he is. There he is.
I was going to call on you first, but I thought I'd embarrass you. So, okay, now.
Senator Reid, with it looking like that Leader McCarthy is more likely than not to become the next Speaker of the House, have you had any dealings with him or any kind of relationship that you've had with him, and can you start holding leadership level meetings with the Big Four in your office again with the Speaker and his cigarette smoke not with him anymore?
Well, I'm going to miss the cigarette smoke because, just to remind everyone, the first meeting I had with John Boehner, I could tell he was nervous. So I said, go ahead and light up. And he did, and he's been lit ever since every meeting I've gone to. I've lived in a family where a lot of smoking going on, so it didn't bother me. So I will miss John Boehner for many reasons. Number one, I liked him very, very much. I thought he had a good sense of humor, anyway, all that kind of stuff. I know McCarthy's from California, but I haven't had any intense dealings with him, but I look forward to dealing with him during the next 15, 16 months. Okay, thanks everybody.